It's crunch time for a lot of you. Well, I guess it's crunch time for everybody, but if you're in danger of failing, then it's even more so. Anyway, let's do attendance here. All right. Sullivan, not here. Hill, online. Byrne, not here. Baumgartner is here. Tires, to be specific, physically here. Lacey, not here. Thornabar is physically here. Fitzpatrick is online. Huffman, not here. Hamlet is not here. Bayard is online. Johnson is online. Sigmund, not here. Pena, not here. Ray is online. Michael Ball. O'Brien is here. Lloyd is online. Hamrick is here. Davis, not here. Elias, not here. Breeden, not here. And Cooper is here. Physically here. Any questions about, or did I miss anybody for attendance? Let me close this door. All right. Like I said, this is the last week of class. We have to finish chapter 19 and 20. Most likely we won't finish chapter 20, in which case, whatever portions of chapter 20 we don't finish, it will not be on the final exam. Speaking of final exams, they will be online unless you want it in person, in which case you need to let me know sometime this week so we can make arrangements. It is, if I remember correctly, and I'll double check this and post it today, but if I remember correctly, it's Monday at 8 a.m. And it's something like 2 hours, somewhere around there. The questions will be, there'll be about 100 questions, about 50 of which will come from the first 3 exams, verbatim. I'm going to copy and paste them. That's why I've been saying make sure you study your old exams because they're going to be used to write the final. And about the other 50 questions, give or take, will be from this new materials from chapters 13, 19, and 20. Any questions about that? All right. Like I said, it's going to be online, just like we've been doing since you're used to it. I don't want to throw you a curveball. That's what we're going to continue to do unless you wanted to do it in person. If you want to do it in person, it'll definitely be, once I confirm it, in here Monday at 8 a.m. That part's not flexible. What is flexible if you want to do it online, if you want to do it some other time, I'm here to help. Maybe you've got some other really big final on Monday and you'd rather take it on Friday. I don't care. Let me know and we will come up with a time to meet online and you can do it anytime next week as long as that slot's not taken by another one of your fellow students. So if you want to do that, make sure you contact me early and I'll pencil you in. And you and I will meet online and we'll turn the cameras on and the microphones on and I'll be able to see you and I'll be able to see your screen and you do the exam. And if you need more time to take it, I don't care about that either. As long as I can see you and hear you and see your screen and I know you're not like looking questions up, then you can have as much time as you need. Any questions about how that's going to work? All right. This week's lab, I haven't posted it yet. It'll also be online. So I'm going to try to make it easy because it's the last week. I know you guys have a lot of work to do. So I'm going to try to keep things easy. Speaking of it being last week, one last thing. A lot of you are missing attendance. So, you could look at the grade sheet to see when you're absent and just watch the video from that day. Or if you want, if you've got the time, just go back and do all the videos and all the questions. Because at the very least, if you were present that day and you watch the video anyway and you say, hey, I did the video for August 16th and I look back and you were there, points, and those points go towards independent work. So either way, you're going to get credit for it, whether it's for an absence or independent work. Plus, it'll help you prepare for the final. So I think that's it for updates. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Obviously, since we're like going down to the wire, Friday we'll be working on chapter 20. I'm almost guaranteed we won't be done. So we won't officially have time for another review, meaning this is going to be very unorthodox, but probably Friday afternoon we'll have to do an unofficial exam review. So go ahead and start thinking about that now when you would want to meet if you want to. It's going to be, obviously, you don't have to be there, but sometime Friday afternoon I'll be online to answer your questions. All right. Any questions about anything? Let's jump into it. ended up, let me back up here. We were talking about sustainable resource management. So let me back up. What we were talking about that in the context of applications of population ecology, because remember, this whole chapter is about population ecology. So once we finish the first two big bullet points, talking about what population ecology is and how it works, then we got into this one that we're on right now, which is applications of population ecology. In other words, why is this important to you as a non-biologist? How is this stuff used? And then again, one of the last thing we talked about was sustainable resource management. In that, I was using this hypothetical example of maybe if you work for the DNR and you're responsible for figuring out how many fish West Virginians are allowed to catch, how many trout can they catch this year? You know, that's basically it. And I was saying the sweet spot, and that's the thing you need to know for the exam, is basically what the sweet spot is right there. It's that halfway between 0 and carrying capacity. So remember, if you look at the population growth, it looks like that. This right here is carrying capacity at the top. This right here is 0. So what you want is your population to be right there around 50%. So for example, if your carrying capacity is, I don't know, 100,000 trout, then you want West Virginians to catch about 50,000 trout, because then you're still producing a bunch, but also at the same time, you're still being able to catch a bunch. So that's the sweet spot. Anyway, when I finished that, I was, like I said, I was giving you hypothetical examples, but then I finished it by saying, well, your book gives you a real example. So let's talk about this real example real quick. And that would be the North Atlantic cod fishery. So we're still talking about fishing, but instead of it being hypothetical, this is something that actually happened. Your book points out the fish are the only wild animal that is still hunted on large scale, which is kind of a weird word. Usually you call it fishing, but technically it is hunting. You are hunting fish. It is an animal. They are very vulnerable to overharvesting. And again, this book example we're giving you is the North Atlantic cod fishery. The reason they messed up, the biggest reason they messed up, is because their estimation of the population was too high. So again, if you're trying to hit that sweet spot between 0 and carrying capacity, and carrying capacity is something that you actually have to calculate. It's not like you can just look up in an encyclopedia and it says, all right, the carrying capacity for the North Atlantic cod is whatever number, right? It's based off of what things. So if you think the population is too high, right? Like let's say they thought it was here, but it was actually right here, right? Then they went for this sweet spot right here. But in all actuality, the sweet spot was probably way down here. So because of that and some other things that are listed on that slide, too many fish were caught, the planning didn't work right, and the fishery collapsed. And here's a graph showing what happened. This is just an example. I'm not going to give you any specific examples, but you can see right past around 1990-ish, right around here, you can see where it just collapsed. And again, that's because of poor management. That's because of people not properly understanding population ecology. So they mismanaged the processes. They did their math wrong. And then because of that, we've lost a whole fishery. And your book was published, I think, is 2016. As far as I know, it is still like that, because look here, between about 1990 and 2015-ish, nothing happened other than right there. So it's probably done for good. And that's a very bad thing. Obviously, it's not that big of it. Well, it is kind of a big deal. But if you're just talking about one fishery, the North Atlantic cod fishery, you might not think that's a big deal. But as we lose other fisheries, we lose a major source of food for humans. So that's not good. Anyway, sustainable catch rates can't be estimated without knowing life history traits. This goes back into the idea that it's not just knowing the sweet spot, right? You also need to know those life history traits. And this is a good time to remind you of what we talked about 2 weeks ago. Life history traits are, what is the age that they first reproduce? How many offspring do they have? How often do they reproduce? All these things that you need to know, because you might want to say, look, you can catch these fish, but make sure they're older than this year or younger than this, whatever. You want to hit the right age too, because you want to make sure you're not destroying breeding fish. So anyway, I like that your book points that out. Population ecology alone is not sufficient. So the stuff we learned in this chapter, that in itself is not even enough. Sustainable fisheries require knowledge of community and ecosystem characteristics, meaning like you need to know a bunch of stuff about that fish. What about the predators? Are there like a bunch of their predators this year as opposed to last year? In which case they're more at risk, in which case probably you should catch fewer of them. And anyway, next chapter, we'll talk about this, community and ecosystem characteristics. So I think your book was just giving you a preview saying, hey, this is some stuff we're going to talk about later. Any questions about sustainable resource management? All right. And keep in mind, sustainable resource management, I keep talking about fish. That's just one example. there's a lot of examples you can think of, especially anything in the wild. If you think about timber harvesting, for example, anything where we're harvesting stuff from nature, you want to make sure that you're not harvesting more than that can be replenished, because if you harvest too much, it's not sustainable. The next thing we're going to talk about is, and we'll also talk about that in chapter 20, if I remember correctly, and if we get around to it. And to me, this is one of the more fascinating of the bullet points. I'm very interested in invasive species. I don't know why, but I am. Anyway, what is an invasive species? You need to know it for the exam. It is an organism that is introduced to a non-native habitat that has devastating effects on the ecosystem. So basically, it's not from there, and that's bad. And I say that for a reason. Like, you have to have both of those things. For example, if you were to put a crocodile into a river in Alaska, that would meet the first half of that criteria. That would be an organism introduced to a non-native habitat, but a crocodile would die very quickly in an Alaskan river, right? So it wouldn't have a devastating effect on the ecosystem. It would just die and decompose and probably have a good effect, some extra nutrients, right? Anyway, like we said, non-native species spread far beyond its original point. That's another good point too. I guess technically, for example, if I were to find some tree from, I don't know, Australia and plant it in my backyard, if for somehow it thrived, if it didn't spread beyond where I put it in my backyard, it's not invasive, right? Because it hasn't spread. It might survive, unlike the crocodile example I used, but it hasn't spread. It hasn't caused any damage. It's not invasive. Anyway, if you download this PowerPoint, you can see these pictures here. Each one of these pictures is actually a link. So if you click it, you can watch little short videos. Does anybody see what these pictures are of? It's all the same invasive species. All three pictures are the same invasive species that your book doesn't list. But any idea what those are? It's kind of hard to tell.
Most of those fish, I think they're in Michigan or somewhere, the Great Lakes area or something, but they jump out of the water.
Yeah.
And they fly at you.
They're crazy. It's called Asian carps. I don't know if you can see right here. They are insane, and they're very invasive. But it's an interesting one. You should look it up if you're interested. It really is interesting because, like I said, he said too, they jump up. So if you're like booking down the river in your boat, they injure people. Like, they'll jump up and get smacked in the face. You can see here, that's what that middle picture is. That guy just got hit by a fish. You can see on the right, there's a guy doing water skiing, but he's got protective equipment on. And he has a net because he's catching them, because they really are. There's so many of them that easy to catch. And they are so dangerous that you would need protective equipment. But anyway, that's just an example. Let's move on to invasive species. This next slide gives you a lot of stats that kind of says, hey, this is why this is important. But I'm not going to ask you any of these stats. So here we go. In the U.S., there's hundreds of invasive species. We usually talk about animals. Obviously, the first example I gave you was a fish. But there are other invasive species like plants. You can look it up if you want for West Virginia. There's some invasive species. A lot of them are plants. We have a lot of invasive plants in West Virginia. Anyway, the estimated cost for the United States is $137 billion a year. That's a lot of money to the economy. And again, or what I like about that is, you don't have to be some kind of environmentalist or a tree hugger, as they might say, to care about this. There's some real number issues. Like, this is a money issue as well. As I kind of mentioned earlier or alluded to, not every species that introduces successful. Therefore, if it's not successful, it's not necessarily an invasive species. Not everyone that survives become invasive. Those two kind of go together. And your book also points out that there is no single explanation of why a non-native species turns into a damaging pest. But the overall theme that they all have in common is that invasive species typically exhibit opportunistic life history patterns. If anything, that's what you need to know from this slide. And I might not even ask you that. Invasive species typically exhibit opportunistic life history patterns, which goes back to what we learned 2 weeks ago. Because there was two life history patterns we learned about. There was opportunistic and equilibrial. Opportunistic, as the name implies, they take advantage of good situations for them, like the proper climate or the right amount of water or resources. Anyway, any questions about this slide? The next slide, I'm going to get into an example. It's just an example, and as usual, I will not ask you questions about it, so you can just sit back and enjoy the story about cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is an invasive plant, and it's from, or where the location where this happened is the arid western United States. This cheatgrass covers millions of acres that were formerly dominated by native grasses and sagebrush. And this is where this is important. that bullet point right here. Because if you're just some regular Joe, or even me, had I not been teaching this particular example, if you were to go out to the arid Western United States and see these millions of acres of cheatgrass, and like 10 years ago you were there and it wasn't there, and you saw millions of acres of native grasses and sagebrush, you might not notice a difference, right? You should see a bunch of grasses. To you, it's the same. And a lot of people don't get this, and they might think, what's it matter? It's one plant versus another. But as your book points out, well, we'll talk about, first of all, why it's invasive. Usually invasive species outcompete the native species, right? So how does the cheatgrass do it? It produces seeds earlier and in greater abundance than its competitors. So all the native grasses and sagebrushes, they didn't produce as many seeds, and they didn't put them out as early enough, or as early. So this cheatgrass, it's putting out seeds, and the seeds are sprouting before the native stuff even has a chance to put out any seeds, the few that it puts out. Another thing that it does is it matures in early summer. And when this happens, you know, when you think of summer, especially in the arid Western United States, it becomes really dry. And therefore, this stuff becomes extremely dry and flammable. And that creates an abundant fuel that is easily ignited by lightning or a stray spark. So in other words, not only does it outcompete by reproducing better than the local stuff, but it also provides a kind of a bad environment for the native stuff, because cheatgrass fires are more intense, right? Because they're, you know, like we said, it's drier. They are more frequent also than fires that the native plants are evolved to tolerate. So again, as you might know, and I mentioned it before, occasionally in this semester, fires are a normal thing in most ecosystems. So to have small little wildfires, that's normal, and usually normal is good. But these aren't normal, right? The native plants were not evolved to put up with that kind of heat and that frequency of fires. So after a few fire cycles, the native plants were gone. And again, the layperson might think, who cares? You got one plant versus another. What's it matter? And this is why it matters. So you lose all those the native plants, and it's not just the plants that are gone. You also have over 150 species of birds and mammals that are now without food and shelter, because many animals and plants are very specific to what they're evolved to. So certain animals need certain plants to survive. It's not just like, you know, if a plant likes that, or if an animal likes plants, it likes all plants. It's not necessarily the case, right? They're evolved for certain things. So again, here you replaced native grass with an invasive grass, which might not seem like a big deal, but it is, because you completely screwed up the whole ecosystem. And then the next chapter, we'll talk about why ecosystems are important. Again, it's not just a tree hugger thing, as you might say. It's actually important, and we'll talk about that later. Anyway, another issue is that climate change has hastened the transition of rangeland to fields of cheatgrass. How has that happened? Well, cheatgrass responds to increased CO2 levels. And we know CO2 levels are rising because we are burning a lot of fossil fuels, and we're doing other things that we didn't used to do. So because of that, we have higher CO2 levels. And cheatgrass is better than the native grass at absorbing all that CO2, which sounds like a good thing. And it is in a way, because it's good to get the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But the problem is, again, that the cheatgrass is outcompeting the native grass. Anyway, because it can increase or absorb more of that CO2, it grows faster than the native grasses. It accumulates more tissue, as you know, right? Because what happens with photosynthesis? It takes that carbon dioxide, it uses the energy from the sun, and it makes glucose, right? It makes other materials, right? So that then becomes more fuel for the fires, and the process continues. Any questions about cheatgrass? I'll remind you, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you anything about that on the exam. Here's a picture of cheatgrass. That's what it looks like. You know, if you were to show that picture to me, I'd be like, okay, there's some grass. Doesn't look scary. And again, if not for me teaching this, even though I'm a biologist, I don't know every single invasive species around the country. So I would just look out at a field of cheatgrass and say, okay, that looks good, right? It looks healthy, a bunch of plants, but it's not. And again, you need to know these things. Someone would need to know this to know that it's a bad thing. Another example, let's give an animal example. Burmese pythons. This one hits closer to home for me because I'm from South Florida, or I started high school in South Florida. Anyway, what happened? People had them as pets. They set them loose in South Florida, specifically around the Everglade area, because they're like, hey, this looks like an environment my pet snake that I don't want anymore would enjoy. And they are correct. That is a very nice environment for those snakes. So because of that, these Burmese pythons are very abundant, and they are bad because they eat native birds, native mammals, native reptiles, and native amphibians, because all that wildlife is not evolved to get away from Burmese pythons. They don't even see them as threats, right? So because of that, it's an issue. Any questions about that? I could go on and on about invasive species. There's a good example of Guam. Guam's this really nice tropical island in the South Pacific. I went there once and I thought it was beautiful, but I noticed that there were no birds, and I thought that was weird, and I never thought about it again until many years later when I started studying biology and I looked into it, and it turns out there's no birds because there was an invasive snake. How did the snake get in there? Airplanes, snakes on planes. Because in World War II, there was a lot of planes going around from island to island. So what happened was the snakes would crawl up the wheel well of an airplane, and if it survived it, made it to Guam, which apparently must have happened at least once, then you get these new snakes on an island, and again, all the birds were not evolved to stay away from those snakes, so the snakes killed pretty much all the birds. And what's even cooler is they're trying to kill them now, and they have a lot of cool ways to do it. So I've seen pictures of helicopters. They'll take helicopters in Guam and drop out parachute mice out of them, dead mice that are laced with Tylenol. So the snakes eat the dead mice, then they overdose on Tylenol, it destroys their liver, and it kills them. Anyway, a lot of cool stuff with invasive species. Cats are an invasive species. Don't get me started on that. Anyway, biological control of pests. That is the next bullet point under applications of population ecology. Biological control of pests. Here we go. As we've already said, invasive species outcompete native species. How? Well, there's an absence of pathogens, like diseases and stuff. Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, there's going to be diseases and viruses and bacteria and fungi, and predators, all this stuff, predators, herbivores, those all exist. But, if you're a tree from China, for example, and then you get planted in the United States, well, the diseases that do kill you are in China. So yeah, there's a bunch of diseases in the United States, but they might not kill you. So pathogens doesn't matter to you. Predators, yeah, that's not what we're talking about if we're talking about plants. Herbivores, again, usually things are very specific. If there is an insect evolved to eat a specific plant, for example, then the plant might be free of those herbivores if it's in a new spot. But anyway, that brings us to biological control. What is biological control? That is the release of a natural enemy to attack a pest population. If anything, you might need to know this right here. You need to know what a biological control is. And it's kind of in the name, biological control. The only thing you're going to need to remember is, all right, what exactly are we controlling? If you remember that, you're good, right? Biological control obviously means we're using living things to control something. So just remember specifically what kind of living things, natural enemies, and what are we trying to control? Basically, invasive species or any other pest population. Biological controls are used to control insects, weeds, and other organisms that reduce crop yield. So yeah, it's not just invasive species, it's also crops. Actually, it's usually crops, not always, as you'll see. I'll give an example that is not for crops. But any questions about this slide? All right, the next slide, I'm going to give you a book example. As always, it's just an example. You do not need to know the specifics for the exam. But the example is St. John's wort. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but that is a long-lived European weed. And it also invaded the western United States. When it did that, it overgrew millions of acres of rangeland and pasture, and it left few edible plants for grazing livestock. So again, the layman person might look at it and just see a field of plants and be like, okay, that's okay. I remember 15 years ago when I came here, it was a field of plants. But St. John's wort cannot be eaten by grazing livestock. So again, this is more than just a tree hugger thing where you might say, oh no, the native grasses are gone. That hurts my feelings. No, this actually has real consequences because people need livestock. That is someone's livelihood. So this invasive species killed the native plants. Therefore, these people have nowhere to graze their livestock. Anyway, how did we fix it? Researchers imported leaf beetles from the native region, right? So again, the St. John's wort is not from here. It's from Europe. So when we came over here, it had no native herbivores. So nothing was eating it, had nothing controlling it. So they figured out what was eating it back home, and they brought it in, and it worked. That reduced the weeds to less than 5% of what it was, and that restored the land's value. So that's just an example of biological control that worked. Again, I think it's a great example because it shows why that's important. It's not just because somebody likes the native grasses, right? This is important. That's somebody's livelihood. So that's an effective example. Let's talk about an ineffective example. Let's talk about a failure. And again, this is just an example. You do not need to know these details for the exam. You might for the study guide. But anyway, mongooses. What are mongooses? They are fierce carnivores. They eat rats, amongst other things. So rats eat, rats themselves are also an invasive species. They eat all kinds of stuff, including sugarcane. So back in the day, I think it was in the Caribbean area, people were growing sugar. That was their livelihood. They had plantations. So we had these rats eating the sugar. That wasn't good. It was costing them money. So what do? They brought in these fierce carnivores, these Indian mongooses. And it kind of worked because they did kill all the rats, but then they themselves became invasive because they were eating reptiles, amphibians, and birds that were all local. So, again, that's an example of one where it failed, depending on how you look at it. They did eat the rats. They did kill the rats, but then they became invasive themselves. And cats are a great example of this. A lot of times cats have been brought in for the same purpose, to kill rats. And they do a good job of that. But then they kill a bunch of other stuff. Cats are horrible. If you look into it, they're responsible for so many extinctions around the world of native species. But anyway, any questions about that? Here's a picture of a mongoose about to get an egg. It got caught red-handed, red-pawed, whatever. All right. The next section is the process of science. We have this every chapter, the process of science. We skip it every chapter. So suffice it to say, I'll just say this one's about kudzu. If anyone's ever been in the South or familiar with the South, kudzu is very invasive. Here's a picture of it. You can see it basically eating a truck that's been overeaten. And you can see back here, this is all kudzu. It might be hard to see, but all that is kudzu. And it's actually coming to West Virginia. You can look into it if you want. Anyway, as always, we're going to skip it. I recommend reading it because it's good to get your brain thinking scientifically, but we don't have the time to talk about it. Basically, they found out ways to kill it. There you go. All right, the last bullet point under applications of population ecology is integrated pest management, which is a great segue. Because we were just talking about biological control of pests, and integrated pest management kind of involves that a little bit. Your book points out that agricultural operations create their own highly managed ecosystems, meaning, I don't know, if you go out and forage for food, maybe you're just going through the forest and you're picking up, that plant's edible and these nuts are edible. That's one thing. But what we do in in agriculture is we produce ecosystems, right? So if you're growing corn, that's it. You've got that ecosystem that is directly involved and specifically involved in growing corn. You don't want anything else growing unless it benefits the corn, right? So it's not a natural ecosystem. It's an artificial one. Because of that, these ecosystems have genetically similar individuals, aka a monoculture. You don't need to know that. And that might not sound like a big deal, but it is. And we've talked a little bit about this, and we'll talk about it a little bit more moving forward. But you don't want a bunch of genetically similar individuals. How many of you on the news or know somebody, well, definitely on the news, but does anybody know anybody that's died of COVID? You do? I do too. I also know a lot of people who haven't died of COVID. And a lot of that has to do with genetics because humans are not genetically similar, right? So some of us genetically are predisposed to dying from COVID. Some of us genetically are predisposed to being fine from it. The same kind of stuff happens with plants. If they are genetically similar, and there's some kind of plant disease that comes in, if it's going to kill one, it's going to kill them all. That's actually happening with bananas. Bananas, I think coffee, chocolate, a lot of those are at risk because they're genetically similar and there are diseases killing them off. Anyway, so that's the one bad thing. They're genetically similar. That's a disadvantage. Another disadvantage is they're planted in close proximity to each other. So if you're an herbivore that eats that particular plant, that's a smorgasbord for you, right? You don't have to go all through the forest to find what you're looking for. It's like, here's a corn plant, here's another corn plant, here's another corn plant, right? They're really close, really easy to find. So all of these reasons, all these things listed, basically just show you why agriculture presents challenges, right? So like an invasive species, most crop pests have an opportunistic life history. You might need to know that for the exam. And if anything, that's probably it. that if we're talking about crop pests and in addition to invasive species, they usually exhibit an opportunistic life history because that enables them to rapidly take advantages of favorable habitats. Meaning, for example, if you're a farmer, you've got a field of dirt at first, right? But then you sow your seeds, you water it, and then boom, when the conditions are right, all your stuff blooms. Now all of a sudden you have a field of corn, for example. And if you are an insect that eats corn and only eats corn, then you went from having nothing because it was just a field of dirt to all of a sudden having a bunch of corn, a bunch of resources. Well, you want to take advantage of that very quickly. Anyway, the history of agriculture has many examples of devastating pest outbreaks. You don't need to know these examples, but the boll weevil is one example. That was something that decimated the cotton industry way back when. And again, I'm from the South, so I've heard about these things. These are things you talk about. They did, from generation to generation, they talk about how that affected them years back. Anyway, if we're talking about the boll weevil, its unstoppable spread severely damaged local economies and had lasting impacts on the region. Just in an example. Moving forward. So still, right now, we haven't even talked about integrated pest management. Right now, we've just kind of like set the stage. Like, hey, this is why agriculture is important. This is why agriculture is in danger, why these ecosystems are, fragile. And now that we've talked about that, let's jump into it. What would you do? What do you think? You've got a bunch of insects destroying your crop. What would you do? What's your first thought? You don't even need to overthink it. I'll tell you. Yeah, insecticides, right? That would be my first, or pesticides, right? That would be my first thought. Like, all right, let's kill them. And we do that, right? But that also has its downsides, right? Pesticides may result in populations that are not affected by a pesticide as a result of natural selection. And we talked about that. That was an example of natural selection in chapter 13. There was that picture of some kind of field of crops. And those pictures, little drawings of insects. For some reason, they drew cockroaches, which is weird, but whatever. And then remember, they had like little alleles on them, the green alleles and red alleles. And one of the alleles made them resistant to the pesticide. And yeah, so anyway, we already talked about that. I won't get back into it. Just remember that pesticides do create basically insects that are resistant to the pesticides. Also, pesticides do more than kill what you're after. They also kill their natural predators. So again, if you're trying to kill the boll weevil, since that's the last example we used, yeah, you put out pesticides, you kill them, that's good, but you also kill the things that kill the boll weevils, and that's not good. Another thing that's not good, if you're talking about pesticides, is that you're killing the pollinators. You're killing the things that are pollinating your plants. So yeah, you might be killing the thing that are eating your plants, which is good, but if your plants can't pollinate, then it's useless, right? You cannot have fruit and cotton, any of that, without having things pollinating them. So your book points that out because, again, pesticides are useful, but they also have their disadvantages. And that finally brings us to what this whole thing is about, which is integrated pest management. Now we've set the stage. Let's actually talk about what it is. IPM uses a combination of biological, chemical, and cultural methods for sustainable control of agriculture pests. So let's talk about this very quickly. A combination, right? The first thing we talked about is biological control. And we already talked about that, right? So biological control would be bringing in a natural predator, right? You would use a living thing to control it. We talked about that. Chemical control. Well, we talked about that right here. That's pesticides, right? Pesticide is a chemical control. The only thing we haven't talked about yet is cultural methods. Any guesses what that might mean? Like, what's that cultural methods? How is that involved with pest management? No guesses? We'll come to it. That's okay. So anyway, integrated pest management. It advocates for tolerating a low level of pests as opposed to aiming for total eradication. That would be a cultural thing, right? That's not biological control. That's not chemical control. That's just decision making. You've decided that you're not going to try to completely eradicate the pests. You're going to tolerate some of them. Another thing you can do, and this is a cultural thing because this is a decision making process, is lower the carrying capacity. So again, if you have boll weevils that specifically eat one type of crop, well, grow that crop this year and the next year grow a different crop. So the boll weevils will come back to eat whatever you had, and now you have something different. They have nothing to eat, so they die off. And then a new crop pest comes in because you have a new crop. And the next year you have a new crop again. So then that pest is gone. So that would be a good example of cultural differences in lowering the carrying capacity. And again, we've already talked about biological control. but your book gives an example. So ladybird beetles, you might call them ladybugs. Those are actually used to kill aphids, and that's what this next picture is. There's a plant. I don't know if you can see online, but you can see this plant has, these are all little aphids. That's an aphid. That's an aphid. That's an aphid, right? All those little things killing and eating the plants. And these ladybugs are there eating them. So anyway, that's another good example of biological control. Whew. Any questions about integrated pest management? Again, I apologize. I know we're going quick. We're going through these quickly because we're on the last week. That being said, if you ever have any questions you don't feel like asking me now, meet me during office hours or any other time, and I'll re-explain any concepts you need re-explained. Oh, you know what I forgot? Word of the day. So for attendance, if you're online, the first word is dot. Like I'm drawing a dot. Well, I'll just spell it out. Yeah, dot. D-O-T. That is the first word of the day. Dot. Anyway, let's move forward. We are finally to the last main bullet point of this long chapter, which is human population growth. This one's very important. If you ever take my Biology 108 course, this is a good introduction because we will talk about this in depth in that course. So you'll have a heads up. You'll have a head start if you pay attention and do good in this one, in this course. Anyway, here we go. In the few seconds it takes me to read this sentence, approximately 21 people will be born somewhere in the world and 9 will die. Of course, that was prior to COVID. I don't know if COVID's changed things, but yeah, 21 people born and 9 will die. So really quickly, what does that tell you? Is the population growing, staying the same, or shrinking according to those numbers? Growing, right? Pretty simple stuff. And somehow that'll be a test question, and somehow people will miss that. If you have more people being born than dying, the population grows. Mind-blowing, I know. Anyway, the cause of population growth or decline, if it technically happened, but it doesn't really happen for us at the moment, is an imbalance between births and deaths, which is what I already got out, right? We have an imbalance right now. We have more people being born than dying. That's an imbalance. Therefore, our population grows. Scientists think that the human population should continue increasing for at least the next several decades. So we have basically a problem, and I really get into it in more detail. I almost hate to use the word problem without having so much time to talk about it, but the human population growth is a blanket statement of problem. There's a lot of caveats to that, but for this course, we'll just leave it at that. Anyway, despite the fact that we're expected to continue to increase, the number of people added to the population each year has been declining. So that might sound strange. And when I show you the graph, it might seem even stranger. But before I come to that, I want to point out this bullet point right here. If you download the PowerPoint and you click this little link, you'll see an 11-minute video that talks about human population growth around the world. But here's the graph that might seem confusing, and you make sure you understand it. Here we go. We're looking at human population growth. So this line is the total population, right? So you can see here in 1750, all right, since we're talking about total population, we're looking at the right side, right? Not the left side. Total population around 1750 was what? It's millions, so I don't know. Excuse me, billions. So 500 million people? No, maybe about 1 billion people. So you can see that. And then about the same there, about the same in 1850, a little bit higher, 1900. And then all of a sudden you can see the population skyrockets. So you might get a question on the exam where I show you a graph like this and ask you to interpret it. So I might give this to you and say, what was the population in the year 2000? And you would just look at 2000 and go up here, and you might guess around 6 billion. See how that works? Pretty simple, right? So that part's pretty simple. Here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. These bars are the annual increase, right? How many? So yes, we can see the total population. That's the red. But the orange bars are how many people are being added every year. So look at this. You can see here, starting right here, that was the maximum. Ever since then, what is that? Ever since, not too far, a little bit before 2000, ever since then, the number of people we are adding to the population every year is decreasing. But notice that the population total is still increasing, and it's still expected to increase. Meanwhile, the number added every year is expected to decrease. Can anybody explain that? How is it that we're adding fewer people every year, but the total is still increasing? Does that make sense to anyone? Nothing? All right. Think about this in terms of money. Let's say that red line was not total population, but the total amount of money. This is some bank account. For some reason, you're a vampire. You've been around since 1500, and you're going to live at least until 2050. So this is a graph of your income and how much money you have. And you can see you've been putting away money. So your total number of money, which is the red line, has increased, and it's expecting to increase. Now, your average annual increase, let's call that average annual deposits, right? So what this means is what we're seeing here is that, yes, since before 2000, this spot right here, yeah, you've been putting in less. You've been making fewer and fewer deposits. You've been putting less money into your bank account. But the point is, you're still putting money into your bank account. Does that make sense? So your bank account's still going to grow because you're still putting more in than you're taking out. It's just that you're putting less in than you used to. Does that make sense? So instead of saying, putting in 100,000 a year, next year you put in 80,000. Then the year after that, you only put in 50,000, but you're still putting in money. So even though you're not putting in as much, your total is still going to grow. And that's what's happening with the world population. Yes, we are getting it under control. Worldwide, we're putting in fewer humans as we do on a yearly basis, but the total is still going to increase. Anyway, that's just the introduction. Let's talk about the history of human population growth. We still have 10 minutes, so this will be easy to talk about. We might be able to knock out chapter 19. This is a very simple concept, but people will miss this question. So make sure when you see any questions about this on the exam, you pay close attention. Throughout most of human history, parents had many children. All right, that's not necessarily going to be a question, but some people still do this. But back in the day, people had like 10, 12 kids, right? The more kids, the merrier, because you were putting them to work, right? Kids were an asset back in the day because you put them to work on the farm or, as in your blacksmithing shop, whatever it was. Plus, they didn't all make it, right? So you wanted to hedge your bets. If you have one kid, chances of it surviving, not so good, right? So the more you have, the more chances that some of them are going to survive. Again, that's this bullet point here, right? Death rate was also high. So because of the fact, yes, there was a lot of kids, but that was counterbalanced with the fact that the death rate was also high. So throughout most of human history, and this is the question you'll probably definitely see it on the study guide, might see it on the exam. Throughout most of human history, the rate of increase was only slightly higher than zero. I'm going to circle that part. Throughout most human history, the rate of increase was only slightly higher than zero. And people miss this, and I think why is when their brain reads the question about human population growth, they immediately think of where we're at right now. And right now we have an issue with an exponentially growing population. But throughout most of human history, that wasn't the case, right? We were very slowly growing throughout most of the human history. And again, the reason why, even though I probably won't ask you that, is because even though we were having many, many births, we were also having many deaths. So any questions about that? All right, so that was most of human history. Now we're going to take a step forward. What do you think is going to change on this next slide? Do you think we're going to change the number of children that are being had, or do you think the death rate will change? Birth rate or death rate? Only one of them is going to change on this next slide. Which one do you think it's going to be? What logically came next in the human history? Death rate. Great. You are correct. With economic development in the United States and and Europe, amongst other places, these are just the places your book listed, that led to advances in nutrition, sanitation, and medical care, right? So we learned all these things, and we had these technological advances. We had medical advances. So because of that, the death rate started to decrease. So we still had high birth rates, but now we have low death rates. And what happens when that happens? Well, you have a huge population growth, right? The rate of increase rose by the beginning of the 1900s. So it was around the 1900s that the population started to explode. So because, again, culturally, we were still having many kids, but the death rate was low. So boom, population exploded. By the mid-century, improvements in nutrition, sanitation, and healthcare spread to the developing world. So not just the United States and Europe, but also third world countries, as you might call them. And that also spurred a growth at a fast pace as birth rates far outstripped death rates. And this is kind of where we are right now, this bullet point right here. Generally speaking, places like the United States and Europe and other developed countries, we now have a pretty decent, steady growth rate because, yes, our death rate is low, but also culturally things have changed and there's not as many births. But in developing countries, there's still, generally speaking, a high birth rate, but they also have the relatively low death rate relative to what it used to be. So because of that, in developing countries, there's still a population problem as far as the population growing as quickly as it is. Anyway, any questions about this slide? The next slide is going to give you some specifics. You definitely don't need to memorize these questions. I guess the next word for attendance will be poster, like something you might hang on your wall, poster. Anyway, specifics. The world population skyrocketed from 2 billion in 1927 to 3 billion 33 years later. So in 33 years, the population doubled from not doubled. I'm sorry. It added another billion, right? So you went from 2 to 3 billion. That's a big jump. And at that point, scientists became alarmed because like, this could be an issue, right? If we keep this up, that will be an issue. The overall growth rate peaked in 1962, meaning those bars. Remember, there was the graph, like there was the total, then we had all those bars. Well, remember, the bars are the growth rate. So we're saying the growth rate spiked in 1962. Not that you need to know that number. And what happened at that point? Developed nations had an advanced medical care that continued to improve survivorship, but that was counterbalanced by effective contraceptives held down the birth rate. So that's also a thing that's relatively new. Like look up the birth control pill. That's right about that time, right? It's not like we've always had birth control pills. Definitely haven't always had vasectomies or getting your tubes tied, right? This is all relatively new stuff. So the overall growth rate of the world's population began a downward trend as the difference between birth and death rates decreased. Again, it's a downward trend. The population itself isn't decreasing. The population growth rate, like how quickly is it growing, that is decreasing. Again, thinking about use the money example. So we're not saying there's less money in the account. We're still putting money into the account. We're just putting less of it in every year. Any questions about that slide? The next slide is a visualization. It's just a table of what we're talking about here. Population, the world population. These are trends in 2012. I'm not going to ask you any of this. Again, if anything, and I probably won't do this either, I might show you a picture of this, or maybe some version of this, and ask you a question about it. So you'll have this information in front of you, and I might say, what was the death rate in more developed countries in 2012? And you can look and say, 10.1, right? That's the point. This is definitely nothing to memorize, but you should, as a college-educated person, be able to look at a table and figure something out. And according to my Facebook feed, a lot of people don't know how to do that. Anyway, age structures. We've already talked about this, so we'll talk about this very quickly. When we talked about this at the beginning of the chapter 10,000 years ago, or whatever it was when we started chapter 19, and I was saying age structures are important not just for biologists, but if you're into marketing, you're concerned with the age of the people you're marketing to, or if you're into criminal justice, right? Younger people probably, on average, commit different crimes than older people, things like that. Anyway, age structures help to predict the population's future growth. I'll show you what I mean in this graph. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this, but here's what the age structure looked like at a certain place in 1989. And you can see right here, if you focus in right here, the kids, right? This is below 15 years old. You can see how big the population was of that age group in 1989. So people who were involved in this kind of stuff could look at that and predict, all right, well, probably most of those population are going to make it to the next age group, at which point they're going to be in reproducing age, at which point we're going to have more people. And that's exactly what happened, right? This group of people got to that age, they reproduced, and then we got to that age, right? And then those people got to reproducing age, and then they reproduced. So what you can see from this is that the population growth starting right about here, it became pretty steady because the pyramid does more of this instead of this. If it was doing this, that indicates that people are having a lot of kids. When it's kind of straight down, that's just indicating that the population's replacing itself. Two people, right? A couple has two kids, then you would have a graph doing this. And that's what population momentum is. And there's what you need to know for the exam. Population momentum is the continued growth that occurs after a high fertility rate reduces to replacement rate. That's the most important bullet point. But then, that results from girls that are 0 to 14, which is not the age where they can biologically have children or reproduce. But then they do reach childbearing years biologically. right? And therefore they have more children. And that goes back to this graph I just showed you. So yes, even though they're just here at replacement, right? You can look at the graph and see that it's not getting bigger. It's a replacement. But because the population was already so large that even with them simply replacing themselves as opposed to growing it, it's still going to be large. That's still population momentum. So age structure diagrams indicate social conditions. For example, again, if you're into politics or political science, if you're looking at the age structure, and like I have a lot of young people, have very few older people, or vice versa, you know, that helps. Like, what do you need more kids? Do you need more schools, or do you need more retirement homes? Right? These are the kind of things you need to that you would be concerned with. And the next slide, which I'm essentially going to skip, basically it's the same thing, but the last one I showed you was for Mexico. This is for the United States, and it's a little bit more specific with the dates. But anyway, that is that. Sadly, we did not finish chapter 19. Wednesday, we will finish chapter 19 with our ecological footprint, which you're already familiar with from lab, and then we'll jump into chapter 20. And the last word for attendance is Gatorade. Anybody have any questions? All right, I'm going to log off here. If you need me, I will be in office hours.